Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at a pair of Rhodesian turned South African automatic pistols. This is the Varan PMX90, although when development started it was actually 1980, and the name of the pistol originally was the PMX-80. The gun was designed by two guys in Rhodesia originally, Tony Blackshaw and Stewart Beecham. Stewart Beecham would go on to be involved in several, well, not much more successful, but several other small arms development projects in South Africa much later on. I don't think Tony Blackshaw had any other serious involvement in the gun world. At any rate, what they came up with is actually not a bad semi-automatic pistol. This sort of gun was difficult to obtain in Rhodesia at the time, and so this is one of a few different efforts to produce guns domestically there. Of course, by the time they actually had finished spending a literal decade perfecting the design and getting into production, they were by that point in South Africa, and all the manufacture was also done in South Africa. So let's take a closer look at these two, because we actually have a side eject and a top eject. They went through a couple different models on these. We have two examples, as you saw, obviously, of the Varan pistols here. This is the later model, this is the early model. You could get them in all black, or you could get them in this cool two-tone sort of finish. We'll do most of our looking at this guy, just so that we can focus, because most of the features remain the same with the exception of the ejection port location. Most of the distinctive bits about this gun revolve around the manufacturing processes it was involved in. And in fact, weirdly, in like 1985, these guys won an award for industrial innovation from Barclay Bank, of all places, for this pistol. So what we have is actually a cast and then machined slide, and then the frame is a hybrid. It is part casting and part stamping. If you look at the back section of the frame here, that is clearly a cast element, but then there's a sheet metal piece, stamped sheet metal piece, that kind of wraps around it and attaches to it. So an interesting technique there. We then have a polymer grip assembly on the bottom. They came up with a pretty cool 16-round transparent magazine. Of course, the idea being you could easily see how much ammo was in the mag. Now, these magazines are quite scarce today because for all their coolness, they did tend to crack a lot. Also, interestingly, if they're exposed to a long period for oil, or something like that, I believe, they turned an opaque yellow color. So this one actually started out clear. In response to these problems, the company did develop a different pattern of magazine. They went to a black polymer. This was better, but still not great. These are still relatively fragile, easy to damage the feed lips in particular. And you can see they added some witness holes because it's no longer transparent. Now, the coolest part of this magazine is actually how it disassembles. There are two little tabs that I can push in there, and then the bottom plate just pops out. That's really slick, and it's kind of interesting that we haven't seen anyone else do something like that. There was a substantial amount of effort put into making these guns ambidextrous, which is why I believe they were originally at first done with a top ejection port. And then we have a very long slide release here on the side. You can actually reach that with a thumb, and that I'll show you when we pull this apart, but the slide release can actually be flipped from one side to the other very easily. The safety is also reversible. You can unscrew this, take the safety out, and flip it around. The safety also has a couple of different functions. So in the fully upward position, like that, it locks the whole gun. Can't use the trigger, can't operate the slide or anything. If you only engage the safety this far, it acts as a decocker. So you pull the trigger and then drop the lever the rest of the way, and that drops the hammer to the half-cock notch. So this is not a double-action gun. From this point, if you want to fire, you have to manually cock the hammer, but that was an option built into it. And in addition to that manual safety, the gun also has a magazine safety. And the magazine release can also be swapped from this side over to that side. The sights are fairly small, but they have a little white plastic insert there to make them a bit more visible. The front sight's just a square post. Switch over to the two-tone one for a minute. We have the model marking out here on the front of the slide. Varan 9x19. And then some of the guns, predominantly the earlier ones, have a little Varan medallion in the base of the grips. Disassembly is pretty slick. Internally, this thing is basically a copy of the Browning High Power. So you take it apart by removing the slide stop pin. However, you don't actually have to hold the slide back or move the slide at all. You can pull this pin out from any position. So there we go. And then the slide, take the magazine out. Then the slide comes right off the front. We can then pull the guide rod and the recoil spring, and then the barrel comes out. You can see the obvious similarities here between the Browning High Power and this built-in feed ramp and link. Have a serial number there and a South African proof mark. The copying of the High Power extends to the fire control group. So like the High Power, this has a trigger that pushes up into the slide on this lever, which then teeter-totters down and impinges on the sear on the other side. As I mentioned earlier, the slide itself was a cast and then machined part. The breech block is a separate part in there. A separate part which was also, by the way, cast and then machined. Now they started with a top eject port in order to kind of promote ambidexterity. However, this led to reliability problems. And so they changed it to a side ejecting port, although there were two models of this. The first side ejecting port wasn't cut in the top strap at all up here. So it had a smaller ejection port kind of like that. That wasn't sufficiently better, so they opened up the ejection port like this, and that was the final version. There's not a whole lot else to show you in the frame. That's obviously the trigger pushing up into the slide. Have our hammer and ejector. On some of these later guns, the pins in here necessary to remove the hammer pivot and the safety. These caps are actually single use, so if you pop these off to take this part off or to switch the safety around, you have to get new caps to install on there. Really, this was a functional and usable pistol. Has a couple downsides, being single action only, and it does have a very high bore axis, so it's a little bit of an awkward looking gun. It feels decent in the hand, although again, just that height from the grip up to the sights is pretty extreme. I mentioned that it was really easy to swap the slide stop from left to right, so it's just the pin goes through, and then it has this little tail that sits in that slot in the frame. Well, it came with a little hard rubber plug. That little rubber plug comes out. You can then use it to seal up the hole in the other side of the frame, and then simply install your slide stop on the other side. Now I should point out, this was done on the first version of the pistol, the top eject one. You can see the two cuts in the frame. On the later version, or the last version, the expanded side eject, there isn't an extra cut here. So that level of ambidexterity disappeared after the first version of the gun. In total, a little over 2,000 of these guns were produced, and they were actually reasonably popular pistols in South Africa at that time. There weren't a whole lot of other options around. Most of the other guns that were available because of international embargo were things like Stars and Astras and Llamas and guns from Brazil, Taurus and Rossi. And this was not bad. These had a decent reputation. However, towards the end of their production run, which only went a couple years, I believe these ceased production in 1993, towards the end of that run, they started to seriously lose market share to the Vektor SP1 pistols, which are basically slightly altered copies of the Beretta 92, and they're really, truly excellent guns. So, in fact, by the very end of the production run, they were really trying to sell these pistols, and they actually ended up offering to throw in a free little baby Browning pistol, an ASP 635, that was being manufactured for the same company that made the Varan pistols. So that was the last-ditch marketing effort was, well, we'll give you a free little pocket pistol if you buy one of our service automatics. Of course, didn't work in the long run, and by 1993 or so, these were out of production. So that, I believe, is pretty much the full story on the Varan. Another interesting South African domestic production pistol. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to stay tuned tomorrow for another cool forgotten weapon, and thanks for watching.